This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is whether or not Chimes of Midnight, the 1966 film by Orson Welles, is great or not. I have two people and myself who say it is, and we'll give you our reasons. Chimes at Midnight is Orson Welles' 1966 film. It's one of his overlooked films. It's a film that, until a few years ago, very few critics thought was of any high quality. I always thought it was a great film, and I've got two guests who will argue along with me that it is. On the top of the screen, you see Joe Bendel, or Joe Bendel, I'm sorry, Joe. If you can give a little bit of background about yourself, Joe, who you are, what you do, and some opening thoughts about the film.
Okay, sure. I'm Joe Bendel. I write on film at my site, jbspins.com. I also write reviews for the Up and Times. I've written for Libertas Film Magazine. I've covered Sundance for 10 years as on-site accredited press. I also write for Nightfire now, and I've basically covered all kinds of genre films, classic films, films that interest me in some way or another. And certainly, Chimes at Midnight is one of those films. I mean, just to open up briefly, I'm just really struck by how perfectly Wells fits this character Falstaff, both as a director and as an actor. He really is sort of a Falstaffian figure. You know, he's notorious for his appetite, good food, good wine, just like Falstaff was. And for so much of his career, he was looking for redemption. We think of him for playing these, besides his films as an actor, we think of him playing these villains, these colorful authoritarian figures, these sort of colorful caricatures, which he did this job so he could afford to make his films. And he was sort of playing these caricatures the way Falstaff played the jester or the fool to ingratiate himself with Henry. And I think Wells, as a director, understood how Falstaff was sort of, was this comedic figure on the outside, really tragic on the inside, and you can see this duality throughout the film. You see these scenes that play as comedy, but there's these rough jesting sequences that are actually quite mean-spirited and quite poignantly tragic. And I think Wells really understood those two levels of the film and the character, and he really knew how to bring that out. And this was another chance for him to get his redemption. He opened this film where he took it to a European festival. It was very well received. He bought it here, and the critics rejected it again. It was just like Falstaff. He was thwarted in his attempt with redemption with this movie, and that adds sort of a meta level of tragedy to the film as well.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Tyler Hummel is my other guest. Tyler, like Joe, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself, your interest in film in general, and also opening volleys about Chimes.
Sure. Like you said, I'm Tyler Hummel. I am a regular journalist with Leaders Media, a regular contributing film critic with Geeks Under Grace, and a freelance writer whose writings have appeared at the New York Sun, Rebel Air Media, Angelus News, Law and Liberty, about a bunch of other websites too. And I'm very much in agreement that Chimes at Midnight stands as one of the great accomplishments for Orson Welles. Like obviously, like Joe was saying, we tend to associate Orson Welles with, these authoritarian dictatorial roles a la The Third Man and Citizen Kane. But he really kind of reaches deeper in himself for Chimes at Midnight and really does a good job bringing this character to life. It's not the only time he's ever adapted Shakespeare. He's if across his entire filmography, he did it 3 times. But really, this is the most impressive attempt he did. With any Shakespeare adaptation, you're always going to have kind of this layer of topicality that's going to be on it, because that's just how you have to adapt anything that's been adapted so many times. If you go to William Shakespeare's IMDb page, he has about 10,000 credits or something crazy like that, just because of all the adaptations that credit him in the film credits. Which it makes sense that that's going to happen. But the other two, they're great films, but they don't quite reach as deep. I love Othello. It's very much a 1950s paranoia kind of film. I like the Macbeth adaptation a lot, although the accents are a little grating. But Chimes at Midnight is really when we kind of see peak Wells. This is the movie he wanted to make. This is the movie he aspired to create his entire life. He adapted Henry IV twice prior to this, neither to terribly great success financially or critically. And he finally had this opportunity while he was self-exiled in Spain to do the big adaptation of it that he wanted to do, this massive, epic, dark comedy film that's a great Shakespeare adaptation and just a great piece of film in its own right. It's very impressively done. I was reading back through my review of it, and he financed the film for $800,000, which at the time was about a tenth of what big films like Singing in the or Sound of Music or Thunderball were coming in at, and it still manages to be comparable, if not grander and more thematically fascinating than some of the big Hollywood movies that were coming out at the time. And I guess I'll end there for now, because overall he really hit it home. I believe that Wells said that this and The Trial were his two best films, and I think he's correct in that assessment.
Tyler, let me follow up with you and then just sort of expand or just kick some thoughts about before we dig into Wells, Shakespeare, and the film itself. These films, this film and also Wells' earlier two films, as you mentioned, are most often compared to Olivier's Shakespeare adaptations. And I would argue that the two other films that you mentioned are more Olivier-like, where this is essentially a Wells film. It's Wells not only being Wells and being doing something good, but really, in the 1960s, there he was a man, just scraping by to get money and whatnot. This is Wells showing that you can spin gold from basically, hay. What is your take on the Olivier thing that I mentioned?
I think it's a wash with Othello, because that film, if you know the production history on it, it was stitched together over 3 different countries over the course of about 5 years. And it comes off as a very different feeling film than most of the Olivier films, which are very sterile and focused and mannered in their presentation. And that I wouldn't call the Othello that, but I definitely would agree with that with Macbeth. Macbeth happened right in the aftermath of the Olivier Hamlet, and you can definitely kind of sense that they're both that he's writing coattails, but he doesn't have Olivier's money. He's working with Republic Pictures, so they're shooting it on this very small set. There's a lot of reused assets, very much smaller production in general. But yeah, I would agree that that Chimes at Midnight is the least Olivier of his films, especially when you compare, Harry of Monmouth in Chimes at Midnight to Harry of Monmouth in Laurence Olivier's Henry V. I just rewatched both the big Henry V adaptations last month, and if you compare Henry V to Chimes at Midnight, it's no contest. Henry V feels like an Errol Flynn movie. It's like the Robin Hood movie. It's big and impressive in the context that this is a war movie being directed in World War II, but Chimes at Midnight just runs circles around it in terms of the literary depth and the execution and the visceral nature of the production and just how much pathos it's able to wring out of its audience.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Olivier films say this is Shakespeare, whereas Wells is saying, well, this is Shakespeare via me. Joe, what is your take on comparing Wells with the Olivier film?
Well, I think one thing that's striking about Chimes at Midnight that Wells also did to some extent with Macbeth is that he really reads into the medievalness of the story. I mean, even Henry IV's castle, it's austere. It's just hard it's hard stone and flagstones. You know, we're more comfortable in our little Skype rooms here than we would be living in that castle probably. It looks cold, it looks drafty. The ceilings are, you know, enormous. It's striking, it's imposing. And if you flash forward to the battle scene, it's, you know, muddy, it's bloody, it's confusing, it's chaotic. If you don't know the story, you really don't know who's winning by watching it. And that was all totally by design, totally by design of Orson Welles editing. I mean, this looks like the Middle Ages more than most Shakespearean adaptations that have people wearing tights, you know, speaking in proper British accents. You know, people look unhealthy in this movie. It's one of the things about Welles's performance. It's very physical, even though it's in black and white. If you look at his face, he kind of looks ruddy, kind of splotchy, unhealthy. That first scene, it's a very physical scene, and then he's kind of wheezing, and he's, you know, staggering to that little bench by the fire. You know, viewers are like, oh, I don't know if it's going to make it. You know, and like, well, that's the Middle Ages. People got sick in the Middle Ages. It was a brutal time, and I think he leans into that in this film more than certainly Olivier did, or certainly more than most Shakespeare adaptations do.
What is your take, both of you, and I'll go with you, Joe, first, on the very fact that Wells so audaciously takes a minor character, and I would argue not in any of the plays a particularly engaging character, not to me at least, and yet by weaving the three main plays, what they call, I think, the Henriade, and his two, and one other play that he appears in, and then there's the elegy at the
Mary
end.
Rise of Windsor.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean that takes balls, and he pulls it off, and he really, that's Falstaff. When I think of Falstaff, having seen this movie, I think of him more as a Wells character than a Shakespeare character. What's your take, Joe?
But there's sort of two typical schools of thought for adaptation. One is the text is sacrosanct, I wouldn't touch a word in it. The other is, well, this play is great, but it was written years ago. We need to punch it out. We need to find new themes that resonate, maybe a new character, some untraditional casting, maybe put it in 1950s Hollywood or 1930s Germany. And Wells is sort of right in between. Wells loves the characters, loves the text, loves the stories. But what he does is he takes, well, I'll take a scene from here, some dialogue from here, you know, I'll take this bit from this play here, and I'll just sort of weave it all together. And yeah, it's sort of like the Wells of the brash young man who did Voodoo Macbeth in a way. But in a way, it's also very Shakespearean. Scholars think Shakespeare tailored his text to his audience. And this is, in a way, this is exactly what Shakespeare did. In fact, they say Shakespeare wrote Mary Rise of Windsor because he was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. You know, who knows what Shakespeare would say? But there's a good chance if he saw this film, he would say, oh, I recognize all this. These are my characters, except for the narration, which was taken from a contemporary source. This all makes sense to me. In fact, the Queen might like it. So yeah, it's definitely a very Wellesian approach to the adaptation. You rarely see it to this extent, but it definitely works to showcase this character. And again, it speaks to the affinity he has for this character.
Tyler, your take on Falstaff, the character?
It's definitely a case of the real world embracing a character that might not have otherwise have been as important as he might have otherwise been, because obviously Falstaff is written out of the entire narrative of Henry of Monmouth's life by the beginning of Henry V. And that's I believe in James Shapiro's book on Shakespeare, he talks about the implication is that the actor who played him got fired. So it was just a very practical reality of, oh, we don't have our clown anymore. We gotta We got to write him out. We don't have the opportunity to use him in the play anymore. Which you can imagine he probably would have played a bigger role in the Battle of Agincourt. But in the case, in what we have, the tragedy that comes about from Harry's betrayal of him, it does create more meaning than it otherwise would have had. And obviously, at the time, he was in the the early 1600s, late 1500s. Falstaff was just a popular character by demand. People seem to really connect to him, probably because same reason bawdy comedians are nowadays. People like raunchy humor and comedy and really lewdness into their entertainment, and that's kind of what you get with Falstaff. It's the sense of a character who's really just this kind of gluttonous figure who's fun and enjoys being gluttonous, and it provides a real character contrast for Harry, who is honor bound by his society to not be that, that his reformation, he has no choice but to do it, and he knows he can use that to his advantage. And there's the whole monologue and very early in the book and the movie where he says, my reformation is going to look more lightly upon me than it would be if I just kept doing what I'm doing. And obviously Wells uses that to his advantage in the way that any Shakespeare adaptation is going to be topical. He obviously found the depth in Falstaff in his own life, in his own sense of being a great talent who, in his own words in F for Fake, started at the top and has been working his way down ever since. And you get that sense with Falstaff because, like Joe said, there's the duality of a character who is joyous and intelligent and fun and, a womanizer, as Wells was, has that kind of moralistic underpinning where that character ends up kind of falling apart and being betrayed, dying of a broken heart.
I wanted to just pick up on what you had said about the betrayal, because anyone who knows the Shakespeare stuff knows that at the end, Prince Hal, or Harry as he's known variously, rejects Falstaff, and there's the idea of the two fathers thing. But I would argue that there really isn't a betrayal, and I wanted both of your opinions, because throughout the film and the plays, we know Hal basically makes no bones about it that this is his youthful indiscretion. And I would actually compare the two of them, Hal and Falstaff, to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, except here Sancho Panza moves beyond Don Quixote. What is your take on the betrayal, Joe, and also my metaphor about Panza and Quixote?
Yeah, it's an interesting metaphor. I see where you're coming from. I think the betrayal comes out so viscerally in this film because Wells basically has that option. If a major theater company is staging the Henriade, they're working towards Henry V and the St. Crispin's Day speech. And if that speech doesn't land, the whole production is a failure. So they got to keep Henry somewhat likable. You got to show the pain in him turning his back on Falstaff. Orson Welles had the luxury of stopping when he did. So this is one of the colder Prince Hals I think you'll ever find on film. Occasionally he'll express some affection for Falstaff, but all the jesting is pretty rough. You'll see these scenes of their body roughhousing, and if a parent saw their son being treated that way, they would say, "Jack, these boys aren't your friends." It's really that's part of the poignancy of this character. He's being their jester because he's expecting to be the king's favorite later, and we know that's not going to happen. And because Wells can stop when he does, he doesn't have to soften that blow. He doesn't have to show, oh, it really eats Hal up inside. Hal turns his back on Falstaff, and that's the last we see of him. That's it, he's gone. And that's pretty stark, certainly compared to, say, other Henry V, where it's like, oh, dear Falstaff, I knew him well. He turns his back and never looks back. And I think that's what gives this film some of its tragic potency, its thing.
Tyler?
I would add that he's also betraying. Not just that he's betraying, but in that final moment in both the book and the film, when Hal finally does talk to Falstaff in front of the entire court, he's embarrassing his friend. He's not just saying like, "Oh, I'm not going to be your friend anymore." He's publicly saying, you know, I had dreams that looked like you, but now they're behind me. Fall to your prayers, you old lecherous man. He's publicly repudiating him. It's like this isn't, and this is a knight. Right? Falstaff is a member of the nobility, so this isn't just the king, you know, picking someone out of the crowd and saying, you know, go to confession. This is him publicly dressing down one of the most powerful people in England at this particular moment in the story, and it definitely amounts to a very, very serious betrayal, especially in the, you know, in the seriousness of courtly drama of, you know, how formal and serious these people in those kind of settings had to be. That's not something that's like, you know, you rub that off. This isn't, Hal's not going to go hang out with Falstaff behind the scenes and, you know, still keep his lechery up. Like, this is Hal very publicly, you know, standing athwart him, almost like in a biblical sense. Like, you know, it's him completely repudiating him. And by the beginning of the next book, in Henry V, like every character that works for him is just utterly shocked by his transformation. They're bragging now that he's a scholar, that he's worldly and intelligent, that he's really grown into this king, someone who actually has the wherewithal to invade France successfully, someone who's got this kind of deep bravery and deep sense of willingness to go against the odds and actually win the Battle of Agincourt without, you know, with the odds radically against him. So it speaks to, you know, it's a very deep betrayal as far as I'm concerned.
Let's talk about Keith Baxter, because I have to say, I didn't know much about him before I ever saw him in this film. And he's mostly been a stage actor from what I could tell. But I have to say, as good a performance as Wells gives, he has a much harder character, Baxter that is, as Prince Hal, and he just knocks it out of the ballpark. When I first saw this film, it was not in the pristine Criterion collection. It was probably 10 minutes shorter online in YouTube. This is maybe 15 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, because it was almost impossible to get on VHS or anything like that. But watching the restored version and just seeing some of the close-ups of Baxter's face, I mean, it's just a really, I mean, it's top 5 Shakespearean performances that I've ever seen on film. What's your take, Joe, on Baxter the actor?
I agree. It's Prince Hal, like we never get to see. I mean, he almost plays him like a villain because he's sort of stringing Falstaff along. He knows what's coming, but he does it anyway. There's something. This maybe overstates it a little bit. It's almost sociopathic. He's sort of manipulating Falstaff, manipulating the people around him for his own enjoyment. He knows he's going to drop them, and he does. Occasionally, there's a few scenes of him expressing his fondness for the person, but it's not very convincing. And when you see him joking with Falstaff, it's harsh. You know, it doesn't look like what we think of friendship should look like. It's a very different personality. It's very distinctive. It definitely sets this film apart. It's a great cast in general. It's a shame it was unavailable for so long. But when you go back and look at the reviews, it did open in 1966. It was reviewed by critics, and they just kind of missed it. The New York Times complained about the muddy sound quality, which of course Wells recorded on the cheap because he had no choice. And there were a couple of comments about his great size, and that was it. But when you look at this film in retrospect, this is an opportunity to see Orson Welles, Sir John Gielgud, Keith Baxter is great, you maybe never heard of, but also John Moreau playing Shakespeare. And you can't like work with it a little and give it a little leeway. I think that's why hindsight is so important when you're really analyzing movies, because the hot take when a film comes out, it could look so misguided and so inadequate with the passage of a few years. Because I think now most people would agree this is a major film, even if they haven't said. If you just say, "Oh, it's Orson Welles doing Shakespeare," even if they don't know about film, they say, "Oh, okay, I understand." It was up to that, but the fact that it wasn't appreciated at its time, it just shows you how important it is to view things in the passage of time, in the fullness of time, in retrospect.
Tyler, what's your take on Baxter's role here? Because, as I said, I think that's something that in the newer version that Criterion put out a few years ago, they restored some of his scenes, and I just think it's just a phenomenal performance.
The only thing I'll say against it is that his character and every other character in the film has to work against Orson Welles' performance, and Orson Welles is operating on the highest level of acting possible, and everyone else is great, but it's there's kind of a discrepancy in the sense that here you have this once in a lifetime Orson Welles performance, and everything else it's very good. It's very everyone's doing everyone's turning in exactly the characters they need to. Joe was right that everyone does a really good job, fitting into the scenery and looking like medieval peasants, looking very dirty and grimy and very not manicured or pristine as you tend to get with so many Shakespeare productions. And Baxter does just a really good job filling in that character. And I definitely agree he plays the villain of this narrative, especially if we're viewing Orson Welles' material as the story of John Falstaff's downfall, or the betrayal, or which is the subtextual betrayal of Orson Welles in real life, then by default, Baxter is the villain. He's the force that's screwing him over, leaving him to die, abandoning him to destitution and exile, embarrassment, whatever you want to call it. And Baxter just does this very good job of filling in that role and being regal and strong, but also having this vulnerability to himself as someone who enjoys the hedonism of his youth. He fits both the roles of someone who's able to go out and dress in white hoods and prance about the lily fields and rob innocent nobles, and also someone who can stand on top of the throne and stare down at you and call you a degenerate who needs to go to confession. He's got an incredible range to him. Again, it's just funny seeing it next to Orson Welles.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the comedy aspect here, because I think the comedy here by Welles is so much better than in the individual plays, especially it almost reminds me of you're too young, Tyler, but maybe Joe's old enough. It almost reminds me of Laughing, the old TV show Laughing, where the characters would pop their heads out from behind a board and talk. The way Wells shoots a lot of the tavern scenes, it's like, they're finishing each other. It's almost like coordinate. I mean, in a sense, it's a surreal moment because people don't really react like that, finishing each other's sentences perfectly. But it has such a theatrical quality that I think it heightens the, if we want to call it, the Gilgoodian drama on the other half of the film. What's your take on that, Joe?
Right, definitely. This film is supposed to look like a comedy. It often has the energy of a comedy and the manic drive of a comedy. But underneath, it's very sad. To me, his Falstaff, there's something Chaplin-esque about it, or something very much like the silent movie Comedians, especially that scene with Margaret Rutherford as the body housekeeper, basically, and they're basically a human Punch and Judy show. They're chasing each other around the tavern, beating each other up. But while this is happening, Falstaff is desperately clinging to the last shreds of his nobility, and he knows he's being mocked by everyone in this tavern while this goes on. And on the other side, for Margaret Rutherford's innkeeper, I mean, the money Falstaff owes her, that's a matter of life and death for a woman in her position. I mean, there's nothing funny about a bad debt risk like Falstaff owing her all that money. And I think even though they're going at each other like, Tom and Jerry in that scene, it's also, there's a desperation there. And I think that you see that time and time again in this film. I think that's what really makes it so distinctive.
What is your take on that, Tyler? The Gilgoodian versus the comedy?
I'll just say, in terms of the comedy, in terms of execution, you brought up finding the book less funny than the adaptation, but in my experience for reading a lot of the Shakespeare plays, I don't find the comedy really hits me until I've actually seen it performed, and so I wouldn't compare it. I haven't seen any other adaptations of Henry IV other than this film, so I would want to kind of have some sort of base by which to kind of compare it to. But that contrast is definitely important. It definitely fits into the overall tension of the two narratives that are happening, where you have the fun part of the story being facilitated by Falstaff, and the more serious part by Henry IV. And in the play, Harry is caught between these worlds, and it's this fundamental question of drama. He wants the hedonism. He needs the kingship. He needs to resolve this tension between the fun part of life and the tragic part of life. And obviously, with this adaptation, that means screwing over Falstaff. So you don't really have that without both. And if Wells hadn't given some sort of joviality to the film and made all of the Falstaff scenes accessible and bright and fun and colorful, it wouldn't work. I can't see this movie working without those things. I can't, because some of the best scenes in the film are just the merry old England scenes of them running around the countryside and having fun and drinking. And you really need that. It's the heart of the film. And it's more, and even more than the drama, I'd say. The drama is just there to undercut all of that and to kind of make it clear who's suffering as a result of these choices. I mean, tragedy is ultimately something that doesn't have to happen. This story didn't have to play out the way it did. Hal could have been more sensible from his youth. Falstaff could have been a more moralistic figure who upheld his nobility, but neither of them did. So the one character who was actually able to grow does, and the other character who doesn't falls away. It's very classical storytelling, very classical understanding of the way that our motivations and our desires undercut us and hurt us. Which which now that I'm saying that, I'm wondering if that was meant as self-reflection for Wells, because I don't see him as a particularly self-reflective individual, at least in the version of himself that he put out there. He comes off as kind of an egomaniacal figure, but I could also see them having that kind of underlying self-loathing to him, where he sees himself as the end version of Falstaff and not as the fun version of Falstaff.
When we get to a certain scene later in the film, I want to bring up a point that came to me as you guys were speaking. But let's talk about the opening of the film and some of the early scenes. Most of it is at the tavern. It's kind of lighthearted. There's that great scene of Falstaff and his bumblers trying to rob people. I think it's what's in a birch forest or something. And then Hal and his buddy come and they show him what it's really like to rob, and then they later at the tavern let Falstaff just go on and on, running his mouth, bullshitting basically. Joe, talk about the early setup of this film.
Well, in a way, it sort of prefigures that how it's going to turn against him, because in a way he sets him up. We see him do it almost immediately. That's the relationship. And, again, Falstaff tries to laugh it off when he realizes he's the butt of the joke, because that's been his strategy, to be the jester, because he's expecting to be Hal's favorite when he becomes king. It's in a way, it's a microcosm of the film itself.
Tyler?
I'm always kind of taken aback by how innocent these scenes feel. There's obvious consequences that pour out of what happens. Obviously, the king drags Hal before him. In the play, he goes as far as to say, I wish my enemy's son was my son, because my enemy's son is noble and you're an embarrassment. Which is a pretty harsh thing to say, but the playfulness of these scenes really kind of makes it clear that what side the movie's on, because the joviality of just seeing, Hal goof on Falstaff while he's actively in the midst of an armed robbery. It doesn't feel like the kind of thing where either the play or the movie is judging these characters for having so much fun. It feels, again, it falls back into that Errol Flynn-ness of, swashbuckling fun and lightheartedness, and we're just casual adventurers robbing the rich for ourselves and for our own enjoyment. And the lighting kind of makes it clear that the cinematography makes it clear that this is supposed to be, there's almost like some pre-lapsarian Edenic imagery to it, where it's like these characters are untouched, they're unburdened by sin. They're going about doing this, something that would otherwise be horrible and immoral, but within these characters' perspectives, it's just lighthearted and playful, and there's no real consequences until there are actual consequences, because this is a morality play, and they do eventually kick in. So. It goes back to my point in the last bit of discussion, where you have to have that kind of jovial comedy, or the film just doesn't work.
Tyler, how about the political intrigue and then the descent to war? We get the looming sense of a split within the nation. People are choosing sides, and how would you say that is handled?
It's pretty well. The first time I watched it, I didn't quite have a full grasp on why the Hotspur and his father were necessarily trying to go after the throne, but because it's pretty much resolved in a handful of scenes and just kind of explained. But it's handled well in our understanding that we are in a complicated political space, especially if you know the events of Richard II, which is the play that precedes this, because Henry IV he's got serious blood on his hands. He's not a legitimate monarch. He's viewed with derision by a large portion of the populace, and the fact that his nobles are going after him with slightly more legitimate claims to the throne is not good for his rule. So it says something that, halfway through the story we have to have one of the largest battles in the history of film just to address any of that, and just to address whether or not Hal and his father will actually continue to be the king and prince of England or not. It's an open question until they battle, until they have the huge battle scene. It definitely adds a current of necessary tension and paranoia underneath the proceedings. Although not so much that it really overpowers the fun stuff. Like, you really don't see it all that much in the bar scenes or the robbery scene or any of that. So it's just kind of it plays more into the drama.
We'll get back to the war scene, the battle scene, in a moment. Joe, what is your take on the political intrigues?
Well, I think these sequences actually show how much Gielgud brings to this movie. Like, most of these characters in the movie are sort of larger than life, and some are quite manic, and they're very expressive. But Gielgud is reserved, he's understated, but you can tell that he's agonized by the fact that he's spent so much of the country's blood and treasure consolidating the throne, and he might end up turning it over to his wasteful son. And you can see that agonizes him. I think that's like the other pole to this movie. You have the big Falstaff pole, and then you have the understated, the brooding Gielgud pole, and ultimately we know that's the one that's going to win. But you can sort of see now he brings this sort of regalness to the role, this sense of regret, and this sense of concern for what have I wrought? Has this all been for naught because my son is an idiot? And that's a really important dimension to this film. And I think Gielgud, old school Gielgud, I think Wells only had him for a week, but he made the most of it. And he got his money's worth. And I think this film wouldn't work as well as it did if Gielgud weren't so rock solid as Henry IV.
Yeah, he really plays him as sort of an aloof asshole, so that when he sends his zingers, they really get to his son, because the son knows that daddy means it. So I want to talk about the battle scene in two aspects, because we can talk about the choreography and how this is so wonderfully unchoreographed choreography as compared to, say, in a Kurosawa historical epic, like Seven Samurai or Ran or that. But the other thing I want to circle back to a point that I made, and that I do disagree with Tyler on. I think this is the scene where I think Prince Hal finally gets that Falstaff is just not a particularly good person, and that's when he kills Hotspur, and he tries to and Falstaff doesn't know who killed him, and he tries to pass off that he killed him, and I think, to me, I think I was maybe wrong when I gave the earlier metaphor about Hal and Falstaff's relationship, sort of Quixote Panza, although there's some of that. I think it's more sort of like Fagin and the Artful Dodger, and Prince Hal, though, is smarter than the Artful Dodger, but Falstaff is maybe a more likable guy than Fagin, but it has that kind of relationship to it. So let me ask you, Tyler, about both the choreography, and because to me, this is, I think, where Prince Hal, at least in the diegesis of the film, gets to know that Falstaff is a piece of shit in some ways.
Well, we shouldn't forget that this is when when Falstaff gives his famous speech on honor. He says, "What is honor, heir?" Falstaff doesn't care about honor. He doesn't care about glory or justice or meaning or living up to his stances or his title of nobility. he's just a pure Epicurean, really. When you get down to it, he wants his momentary glory and his women and his alcohol. And when push comes to shove, while there is a heart of gold underneath him, he's still going to, push for power and extort others when the opportunity arises. So the fact that he doesn't, that in the heat of the moment he makes that decision to undermine Hal, it definitely it could serve especially in the book version, to align just where that character is at that point in his journey, and to show Hal what it is he's supposed to be moving away from and what he's going to be moving towards, and to kind of bolster the importance of that final moment where he just fully repudiates Falstaff. So, you're not who I'm not you. I'm not what you represent. I'm growing beyond you. I'm not where you are right now, especially not where you are. It's partaking my moment of glory.
What is your comment, if any, on the choreography of the scene itself, the battle scene?
It's fantastic. I don't know how many extras he actually had, but you can tell it's not a lot, and it looks like a lot.
I think he said he had something like 40 or 50 at the final day.
It doesn't look like that many.
Yeah.
It looks like, a battlefield of hundreds, if not thousands of people on it. But he's so good at stringing the choreography together and knitting it together in a way that's really cohesive, that you really can tell just how much thought and preparation and effort went into kind of making this feel cohesive in a way. He did a very similar thing with his Othello film, because like I said, he filmed it between about 3 different countries, but you can't tell in the edit. Like, there's one famous scene where he cut the character punching, and then it pulled another shot of the character being punched, and those were shot about 500 miles away from each other. But he's just very good at following the 180 rule and matching his shots and making it seem like the illusion is there. And it's really on display with this battle scene, because the illusion that this is a big battle, that this is, the fate of England is hanging in the balance as to whether or not these 2 princes will kill one another, or whether the kings will hold on to their grasp on power. And it feels that, and it has that weight to it. And it really does do a good job of making this feel like the definitive moment of the film, both in the play version and in the adaptation. Because in the plays, this was the battle was originally the conclusion to part 1, and it's very much just kind of the celebration, this celebration moment where everyone's basically happy with what they got, and the King of England stands triumphant over his conquest, and pretty much everyone is expected to be where they are, and obviously in the second part they undermine that, and they slowly build up to the final conclusion. And the battle, putting it in the dead center of the film, really has the effect of kind of making it this kind of gravitational moment for everything that's involved, where like you said, Hal realizes that Falstaff is not a loyal or good person in a way.
Joe, what are your takes on both the battle and the Falstaff Hal relationship turn?
Well, I think this is about we realize Falstaff is a tragic hero instead of a romantic hero, because like tragic figures always do, he just pushes it too far, trying to steal glory for someone and getting caught by the king. And the timing is terrible because by Prince Hal, rather, because this is the moment that Hal redeems himself. His father starts to realize so I can fight. He's not a complete screw up. Falstaff shoots himself in the foot during what should be a moment of triumph. And battle scenes are terrific. It's impossible to really tell who's winning, who's fighting who, and that's how battles were back then. Like in Henry V, at the end of the play, Henry says, "Tell me who won." "I don't know. Who won?" "You won, sire." It's not like everyone was wearing either Yankees or Red Sox uniform. If you just jumped on the battlefield, you'd know where to jump in. Some of the lords might have had their colors, but for us mortals, it just looks like a mass of people, and that's exactly what Wells gives us, just this mass of combat that's just sort of hard to distinguish and just chaotic and muddy and dirty and very true to medieval warfare.
So the film then ends afterwards with the deaths of King Henry IV and Falstaff, and it's interesting because Falstaff's death takes place off stage. We don't see it, but yet we get almost I guess nowadays we'd call it a false hiccup at that. Oh, the king is dead. No, he gets up. He's not really dead. So we get two different portrayals of the two fathers' deaths of Hal. What's your take on that portrayal, Joe?
Yeah, it is very different, but again, this is like the last. This is Patel's final screw up, basically, that he alarms his father while he's on the deathbed by moving the crown, which truly looks like it would gash him in the head if he roll over in bed and hit the crown on the pillow. But it is Hal's final redemption. That he's able to sort of come to some kind of terms with his father before he dies, but he never sees Falstaff again. When he turns his back on Falstaff, he never looks back. One of the interesting supporting players in this is Margaret Rutherford, Miss Marple, who also played a lot of quirky comedic characters. And she had been chasing Falstaff around the tavern before because she desperately needed her money. But she gives this wonderful eulogy for Falstaff because they're kindred spirits. They're outcasts in many ways. They're operating outside of respectable, noble society. And he had these ambitions to return. They didn't come to fruition, and she can respect that. And I think that's why it's so fitting that she's the one who eulogizes Falstaff.
Tyler, the two fathers' deaths, basically contrast and compare.
I mean, it's obviously symbolic. It's the two halves of Hal's character, coming to their end. One being the one, duty and desire, and ultimately Hal's duty wins out over his desire, and he reforms, and he becomes one of the greatest rulers in English history, the uniter of his people, the person who really kind of defined England as a national identity, which, no small feat, especially after everything we've seen in the play, where there are still nobles who actively are trying to hunt down the head of the king, and whom are trying to undermine him. So the fact that he's, finally able to kind of resolve that with himself in the aftermath of both their deaths is important. Although part of the execution obviously just comes as, again, the hiccup of the way that the plays are published, or the way the plays are performed. Because like I said, Falstaff was supposed to be in Henry V, and then his actor just left the company, and that just creates the practical reality where, now you can't do a planned operatic death scene with Falstaff or some sort of redemption arc for him. Like it would have been curious had they done that. Like do what they did in Netflix's The King, where Falstaff falls during the Battle of Agincourt. There's this great moment of solemnity to it, and a final acknowledgement that he or something. I don't know how you could probably execute it about 100 different ways and make it interesting, or to inform the relationship between these characters. But the way it works, because of the accident of history, really it serves as a fitting end to these characters, where the character who's all about duty and who has the grandeur to him dies in grandeur, and the character who is banished and cast forth dies obscurely. He doesn't even get a proper death scene, which it informs the story in a way you couldn't had Shakespeare planned this from the beginning.
Joe, I want to just start wrapping up some final thoughts, things about what makes this film great, etc. But I wanted to ask you, is there anything about the film points that you wanted to make that we haven't touched upon yet?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just, I would just, again, look back to 1966 and how inauspicious the reception this film was. I think, if anything, it should encourage everyone to be a little suspicious, maybe, of film critics' pronouncements. For a while, I've been thinking the Oscars shouldn't honor films from the year previous. They should honor films from 20 years prior, because 20 years after a film releases, we know what kind of legacy it has. And you look at some Oscar winners, they come and go. And I think this is a perfect example of how films really appreciate. In 1966, two of the biggest films at the box office that also received multiple Academy Awards were Hawaii, based on James Mitchell's Cinder Block, and The Sand Pebbles. Maybe some people remember The Sand Pebbles because of Steve McQueen, but Dan, I think if you sent out emails saying, argue why Hawaii is a great movie, you would have gotten a lot of shrugs in response. But in 1966, if you'd said, oh, people are going to be talking about Hawaii in 20 years, they'd say, oh, sure. If you told them they're going to be talking about Chimes of Midnight in 40 years, they would think you were insane. But unfortunately, that's the story of Welles' career in so many ways, and that's why the redemption, the failed redemption story of Falstaff has so much added significance for the fans and admirers of Welles, because it lines up so well as a parallel and allegory, which most likely he didn't intend, but we can read that into it so easily.
Tyler, is there anything you wanted to add about that we haven't touched upon, the cinematography, the sound, etc.? Anything?
I mean, the sound is bad just by rate of how they had to produce it, so I don't think I have anything to add on that. Although I will respond to his comment on the film critics. This film's popularity is definitely tied to the realities of Orson Welles as a media figure, because he was definitely one of those people that in his lifetime people didn't appreciate. I mean, this was still in the period of time when Orson Welles would appear as like a background character in Catch-22, or as one of the supporting characters in the Muppet movie. He was not well regarded. He was Hollywood did not have any sorts of adoration for him. He wanted to come back to Hollywood. He wanted to be the big movie star. He said for years, I wish I could do a film as big as The Godfather. But no one ever came and offered him The Godfather. So he had to constantly forge his own destiny outside of it. And when you're outside of the system is not going to be receptive to you. There's a good a scene in the movie The Magician, which is a documentary about him, where one film writer talks about the film being released at a small art house theater in Chicago in 1965, 66. And he made the decision to call off work that day and see it 3 times in a row on the grounds that I know I'm never going to see this movie again. This movie is never going to open up wide. It's never going to get any sort of release. And I want to have as much of an experience with this film right now while I can, while I have the opportunity. And he describes the film being released in this tiny theater in Chicago, where you have academics from the University of Chicago and homeless people sitting right next to each other, just cheering and laughing their way through the movie because it's just so riotously fun for them. And then it disappears for essentially half a century. A lot of that obviously had to do with bad distribution. You could, there for years, you could get DVDs of it that were like region coded to Europe only, but that was it. There was no market for this. And obviously the market for film has changed a lot in the past decade with things like the Criterion Collection becoming a little bit more wide known. There's such a huge market for cinephilia and young, the film bro culture, that this definitely has more of a market now than it did 15 years ago. There's, if you put Chimes at midnight at a Blockbuster video store, there's no way in heck this movie is going to do any sort of numbers. That, if this or really any of Welles's films, other than maybe Citizen Kane or Lady from Shanghai, will rent a couple of times a week, but you can just tell this would not be the movie. This is not a movie the masses are going to be terribly receptive to. So, like so many of Welles's films, this was deeply tied to Welles the phenomenon, and like I said, in his lifetime, it took a long time for people to actually warm up to him, and he's still controversial. There's still tons of people out there that hate Orson Welles. There's still Pauline Kael types that think Welles is is and was a bad force within the film industry, despite the fact that he was off on his own, financing his own films and getting meager distribution across Europe. And I'm happy that that this is something widely available now, that Criterion has done a great job moving the distribution of it along, giving us a definitive cut that's that we now have access to for the rest of time. This is a movie that, like you said, we're going to be discussing it in 40 more years, because Orson Welles' films are just going to blossom, and they're going to remain in print forever, and no one's going to care about, I pulled up a list from the 1966 Best Pictures. Like, no one's going to care about, I guess, Darling or Ship of Fools in 100 years, but people are going to talk about Orson Welles forever, because his movies are just that good.
Yeah, so there were a lot of late 60s films overlooked. A movie called Seconds with Rock Hudson, Experiment in Terror, which was a great neo-noir by the guy who did later Bo Derek 10. What's his name? I forget the name. The Pink Panther guy.
Blake Edwards.
Yeah, that's right. But I do think it was good that in this version that Criterion released, they called it Chimes at midnight, because I think just, even though Falstaff is the obvious dominant character, I think it allows for people to appreciate and not just focus on Welles. One thing I did want to ask you though, Tyler, you said that Hollywood sort of rejected Welles. The money men, I would agree, did, but actors revered him, and he was constantly on the talk show circuit. Johnny Carson, Dick Cavett, Merv Griffin, etc. I mean, they just love to hear his stories. They would, if he was in town and available, get me Orson Welles. So I do think that he had a great following. Let me just talk about legacy here with both of you. First, the film within the Welles canon itself, and then the film as it has evolved to now and reputationally in the future. Joe, where would you put this in the canon? The reason I'm doing this film is, I'll be controversial here, I think it's his best film. And I think it's better than Citizen Kane. I think it's better than a number of the other films that people have posited as his best film. The Magnificent Ambersons, we'll probably never see the uncut version of that.
Right.
So where do you place this film in the Welles canon, and what do you think about its reputation now and in the future?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm very conflicted when it comes to Wells as a director because I have love for Touch of Evil because it's such a wonderful film noir. But this is, as Wells directing himself, this might be the best because of this sort of poignant, comedic, tragic, multi-layered performance that he does. I would argue that it's probably his best Shakespearean film. Like I said, it's hard for me to pick favorites amongst his films because I am sort of partial to his film noir, definitely Touch of Evil. Sadly, it's hard to say because there's so much that we're not going to see, or at least not see the way we should. A few years ago, MoMA screened a restored match print of The Deep, which was never released. He never recorded audio for it, but he had all this footage of him and Jean Reno and Lawrence Harvey. You watch it and you see the movie in there, and it's just stuck in that match print because he was never able to record the audio, and that's one of the tragedies that we just don't know what we could have had when we talk about his legacy. But it's certainly his best Shakespearean film, I would argue, and it's I can't think of a Shakespearean film that I would place above it unless unless you would allow me to go with Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, which is one of my favorites too. But that might be fudging it a little too much. But I value them on the same level.
How about you, Tyler? Where do you place this in the Welles canon, and reputationally, where it is now and where it's going?
Before that, I will respond to your saying Orson, his popularity was never, was only negative among the money men. I think he kind of fell into the position of somewhat being a has-been, especially in the 1970s when he was doing his famous drunken wine commercials and frozen pea commercials, whatever, all the silly things like that. So I think that the grandeur of Wells probably was a little bit, or again, I'm young, maybe I'm completely off base, but from what I can tell, it seemed like it was a little bit rougher than just the money men didn't want to work with them after.
Well, the critics like Hale that you mentioned too, but the actual artists generally revered him.
Sure, which is probably a big reason why his entire oeuvre has been rehabilitated so deeply now. Now that there's people that actually want to go into his work and really dig into it and study it and make it and preserve it. Now you can kind of tell that he's winning the war, even though he hasn't been fighting it for 30 years. He passed away in 1985, obviously, but in regards to where this film sits, I'll let the poster behind me speak for itself. But can you see it?
No, what?
There's a Chimes at Midnight poster behind me.
Okay.
Yeah, it's my favorite Wells film, and if you in terms of actually ranking Wells's filmography, it's kind of a wash. I kind of sense that it's really just depends on what your values are and what you want out of a Wells film. Jonathan Rosenbaum swears up and down that the theatrical cut of Magnificent Ambersons is his best film. I've seen plenty of people claim Touch of Evil is his best film. I've seen 100 million think pieces on Citizen Kane as his best film, which, everyone loves Citizen Kane, but that kind of feels worn out at this point. And I go back to, if I want to watch something that really encapsulates him, I think Chimes is very close to it. The only other film I think really that comes close to that is The Other Side of the Wind, which I'm also a very large fan of. Which, in some ways, that film also kind of feels like a rebuttal to Citizen Kane, where it's about his own his fascination with trying to do a Charles Foster Kane style character, but not giving you the kind of clear cathartic resolution that he gave in Citizen Kane. And in that film, you kind of also get a lot of his savvy frustration with the film industry and his rivalry with Hemingway. It has all these different meanings to it. It's not autobiographical, though. In this one, in Chimes at Midnight, you really feel the depth of that connection he feels towards Falstaff, that he sees Falstaff as a hero that has been wronged, and that he sees himself as a great intellectual artist that's been wronged. And because it accomplishes all of that while having this wide sense of depth to it, where it's a dark comedy and a war film and a beautifully shot masterpiece made on the cheap by people who just were scraping the bottom of the barrel in the Spanish countryside trying to make anything they could. I think it rises to the occasion and actually manages to be his masterpiece. He said that if he was at the gates of heaven, he would offer Chimes at Midnight as this reason to be allowed into paradise, because that was the one that he poured his heart and soul into, and he felt that he had accomplished the most with. And I'm inclined to agree. I don't know if it's a movie I go back to, if I casually want to watch an Orson Welles film, because his noir films are fun, and Citizen Kane is still sprawling and epic and fun. This is definitely a little bit more of a work to it, but yeah, I'd say Chimes at Midnight is his masterpiece, and I'm also open to hearing claims about every other one of his films being a potential masterpiece too. There's a very strong case for The Trial for that reason, or
except that last ending, which I found just not good. But the last 20 seconds, the explosion. But anyway, is Other Side of the Wind available on Netflix only? Has been given a general release, by the way?
It was supposed to get some sort of release. I suspect it's probably going to get a Criterion Collection release at some point, but it's never been announced. Okay. It's not clear what the producers behind it are doing.
It's the only film of his I've never seen. So,
do you not have Netflix, or?
No, I don't have Netflix. I've got Criterion Collection, so the Criterion channel. But anyway,
I would get a free Netflix trial just to watch it once, and or maybe a couple times, and just kind of experience it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it just as a first-time viewer, because I saw it in theaters the weekend it came out, and it was one of the most interesting movies I'd been able to experience.
Maybe I'll get my in-laws to get their account. But let me ask you both a final question before you go, because I know you have to go, Tyler. Final question is, why is Chimes of Midnight great, and why should a newbie especially want to watch it? And then I'll go to Joe. Did you hear me, Tyler?
I heard you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if the sound went out. Okay.
Joe's muted, so.
Would you like me to start, Tyler?
If you want to go first, go ahead, Joe.
Sorry, I thought you were asking him to go first. I must have misheard you. Sorry.
No, but either one. Let's go with Joe if you want to go first.
I think to put it simply, I would say it's probably the best performance Welles directs from himself. It's also, for all those other things we've said, it's this great kind of medieval, grungy kind of war story, and it's just it's a very human, tragic story, and he really brings that all out in it.
And how about you, Tyler? Why is it a great film, and why should someone who's never watched it before watch it?
Because it's the greatest Shakespeare adaptation basically ever. I'm open to some other ones, but I think this one is really the one that knocks it out of the park. I don't know if you're going to get the full grasp on it on a first viewing, or if you're not familiar with the play, I'd be curious to talk to someone who's never read the play and see how much they comprehend, or especially on just, you know, casual viewing. But it, as an adaptation and a war movie and a comedy and a character study, it is all of these things at once, perfectly synthesized to the point where it just has this incredible sense of depth to it that makes it come across as one of the largest films of all time. It's a movie that's, you know, it's scraping the bottom of the barrel together in terms of a budget, yet it feels so much more substantial than so many films of its generation. And it really stands the test of time as a story that both as a adaptation of a story and as a story told by a very particular artist with an auteur vision towards it.
Well, it was a terrific discussion on this great film. Thank you both. I'll link to Joe's blog, and I'll link to your channel. So thank you very much, Tyler and Joe.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much.